We're in the midst of a huge cultural change. Only 50 years ago, experts had a whole vocabulary for describing the world, which already sounds very foreign to us. They talked about a command and control economy, of engineering the weather, of central planning. No one today thinks the world can be described in such terms. Today, we're much more likely to talk about disorder, instability, turbulence, tipping points, the butterfly effect. This is the vocabulary which has come to us from the mathematics of the last 50 years. And it is this mathematics which is in the process of completely altering our understanding of the fundamental nature of the world we live in, and I believe is giving us a whole new vocabulary for talking about our anxieties about that world.
Looking back, we can see what was not obvious then. Those mathematical discoveries, which would eventually undermine the optimistic view of the world and set us on our way to the anxieties of today. The mathematical roots of our modern anxiety have their beginnings here, in Paris, in 1885. The city was preparing to celebrate the optimistic worldview of science and reason. There was to be a grand exhibition to celebrate progress and democracy. It was the centenary of the Republic.
And towering over it all was to be the world's tallest building, a symbol of everything that they believed in, a perfect hymn in iron to the rational and ordered worldview of Newtonian science.
Newtonian mathematics describes a place that follows clear rules of cause and effect, which make it predictable and therefore ultimately controllable. In the hands of one of Newton's greatest followers, the French atheist and mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace, it became a set of beliefs about the nature of everything, an almost religious belief that the world could be understood as a machine.
There was this strong notion that the world should be mechanistic and deterministic.
David Rouelle is a theoretical physicist and one of the principal discoverers of chaos mathematics.
Newton and Laplace saw the world as a machine, and everybody did, to the extent that they were scientists. They wanted to have determinism.
In a mechanistic world, nothing happens without a cause. Nothing is unexplainable. In this world, if you understood the mathematical rules, you understood the world. Everything was predictable. Science could guarantee safety and progress.
So that you could have this Laplacian, what was sometimes called a sort of clockwork view of the universe, where, you know, if enough people did enough sums, then everything would be understood, because they thought they knew how systems behaved. They thought everything did, in the end, behave nicely. They knew disasters happened. They were perfectly well aware of that. But actually, they thought the mathematics would be able to explain it completely.
And this was ultimately what underpinned their optimism and ours, and made the future seem so open. But beneath the surface of optimism that the world was conquerable and controllable was an undercurrent of worry that perhaps the world was not as tame and safe as they wished to believe. Right at the heart of Newtonian mechanics was a problem which, if it couldn't be solved, endangered the whole belief that ultimately everything was mathematically predictable, because it was to do with the one thing Newton was supposed to have absolutely solved: the orbits of the solar system.
See, the genius of Newton's equations is that if you have two bodies, one orbiting the other, like the Earth going around the Sun, the equations of motion
allow you to tell the exact nature of their orbits and to predict precisely where both bodies will be at any time in the future. The claim of Newton and Laplace is that you simply scale that up and you can predict everything about the universe.
Once you've got a solution, you can say to me, well, I'd like to know where that body is going to be at such and such a time. And that could be at any time in the future or any time in the past. I can just plug in the numbers, the time that you want, and out will come the answer. And it'll give me essentially the coordinates and velocity of where that body will be.
The same mathematics that governed the orbits of the planets also governed motion here on Earth. It was the bedrock of Newtonian science that if two objects began in almost identical orbits, they would continue in almost identical orbits, the difference between them never growing. So if you knew the orbit of one, you could predict the orbit of the other. And in theory, that's fine. In practice, what happens is that as soon as you add just one more body, just three, suddenly you cannot solve the equations and you cannot predict anything. Every major mathematician from Newton onwards had hoped that one day what they called the three-body problem would be solved. But then in 1889, a French mathematician called Henri Poincare discovered there was no way of predicting the orbits. In some cases, no matter how similar the paths were at the start, if there was any difference at all, eventually one would fly off on a different and totally unexpected and unpredictable path. Prediction, Poincare lamented, becomes impossible.
He saw something behaving in a way that he didn't expect, and he realized it was to do with the initial conditions and what we now call sensitivity to initial conditions. And that's what was unexpected, that if you just tweaked something a very little bit, you could get a huge difference in outcomes. That was where he actually discovered what we now call mathematical chaos.
Poincare had glimpsed a profound truth about the planets and their orbits. What disturbed him was that he realized this unpredictable behavior might be present throughout nature. He realized a small disturbance, no more than the flapping of a butterfly's wings, might be enough to create a storm where none was predicted. This was a very different world to Newton's.
And I think the interesting thing is the fact that he was so himself, even Poincare, the sort of greatest mathematician around at the time, was still immersed in that view of thinking that things would all work out nicely, that everything in the end behaved properly. And he was horrified when he discovered the way these solutions worked out and you could get this what we now call chaotic behavior. It was quite shocking to him.
Poincare's discovery struck at the root of a view of the world which neither he nor his contemporaries were yet willing to give up.
The world in which he was living and moving was still very much one that was embedded in that Laplacian view. This very strange behaviour that he discovered was sort of glossed over by the commentators.
People were just not ready to hear that their world was not as orderly as they'd always believed. Then in 1914, in Sarajevo, a tiny disturbance did push the whole world system from its course. This was the tiny disturbance that started the uncontrollable storm. In hindsight, we can see how appallingly prescient Poincare's discovery had been. But at the time, the rest of the world was just not ready to listen. They were still determined to believe that they lived in a Newtonian world, where even the complexities of human affairs could be predicted, and the war would be over by Christmas. When World War I broke out, They all wheeled out their artillery, confident reality could be made to follow their plans. After all, the same mathematics which predicted the orbits of the planets also governed the firing of artillery. The mathematics of ballistics told them exactly where the shells would land.
Of course, at the beginning of the 20th century, ballistics was essentially firing at a stationary object. And you might have to fire over something, so you might not be able to see what you were firing at. So the mathematicians had sort of sorted it out. They had range tables and so on.
The magic of science, this predictability of things through mathematics. Science is not just proving theorems, it's to give us some power over nature about what happens, predicting an eclipse, this kind of power. Building steam engines is also power, and science was built in part about that.
The tragedy of the war was that no matter what carnage unfolded, they believed there was not only a science of ballistics, but a science of war, a way of predicting how many men per mile of front would win the objective. They thought if they understood the science of war, they could control its outcome. They could simply overpower the chaos. In the end, they weren't fighting each other. Both sides were fighting the chaos of reality. In the end, the chaos defeated them all, and 10 million men died. Poincare's notion that a small, unnoticed disturbance could eventually cause an unstoppable storm was the first discovery to tell us the world is less predictable and controllable than we'd like it to be. One of the mathematical roots of modern anxiety. The second was uncovered in Russia by Alexander Lyapunov. He was studying the transition from stability to instability in fluids, but doing so during the great upheavals of World War I and the Russian Revolution. Lyapunov was studying the way a fluid or gas becomes turbulent. It was one of the most intractable problems in all of physics, and he was trying to put a number on that transition from order to chaos. He was trying to understand how systems seem to maintain their order, almost resisting change, but then reach a critical point at which they seem to flip suddenly from smooth to turbulent, from order to chaos. What we now call tipping points.
This move away from the idea that the world is ultimately predictable to one where it's unpredictable is mostly associated, at least in the climate and environmental world, with this idea of a tipping point. So this idea that you push the system and it goes, basically, how far it moves, how far it changes.
Professor Peter Cox is one of the UK's top climate change experts and an advisor to the government.
In that case, you imagine a system, say you're rolling a ball up a hill. You know, if you roll the ball up a hill here and you let it go, it's going to go back down this way. But say there's a peak on the hill. You roll it up so far at this point, it can go either way. And then, of course, if you're at the top of a hill, you can push it an infinitesimal amount and it'll be off. And there's no relationship between the ultimate displacement and how hard you push it. So it's essentially an unstable system.
Lyapunov's work had begun to put a number on this moment of instability. The moment when the ball at the top of the hill is pushed over, when the orderly plume of smoke suddenly becomes turbulent.
Most people, when you ask them what is dangerous, is falling off a cliff, right? I mean, and that's the equivalent of a tipping point, right? It's where the system changes and you can't go back.
But while Lyapunov was still trying to understand instability, his life was approaching its own tipping point, when the chaos of the Russian Revolution and World War I overwhelmed him personally. Tens of thousands of war wounded had been pouring back from the front and brought with them an epidemic of tuberculosis. When his wife became infected, Lyapunov tried desperately to save her. But on October the 31st, 1917, she died in his arms. Hours later, the same day, he put a bullet through his brain. Poincare had discovered that our world might not be as predictable and controllable as we had thought. Lyapunov's work had put a number on the moment of transition from order to chaos, and opened the door to the modern idea of the tipping point. Between them they had discovered what could have been the beginnings of a new and profound understanding of the world. That chaos is a part of the system, not just its breakdown. But Lyapunov was dead. Poincare never took his work any further, and the rest of us, we wanted only to believe that chaos and unpredictability were just a nightmare from which we could wake. We stood at the place where a clearer understanding branched off, but we did not take it.